A wall of water, 6 meters high, moving faster than a car on a highway, hits a sleeping village in the middle of the night. No siren, no warning, no time to run. By morning, entire towns simply don't exist anymore. Not damaged, not flooded, gone, scraped off the map like they were never there. This is the deadliest engineering failure in human history, and there's a very real chance you've never heard of it, because for over a decade, the outside world wasn't even allowed to know it happened. You've probably heard of Chernobyl. You've probably heard of the Titanic. This event killed more people than both of those combined, several times over, and it happened not because of a bomb, not because of war, but because of concrete, rain, and a warning that never made it off someone's desk. August 1975, Henan Province, Central China. And here's the part that should genuinely surprise you. The storm wasn't even the reason people died. The storm was just the trigger. The real failure had been sitting there for over 20 years, quietly, patiently, waiting for exactly this kind of night. This is the story of the Banqiao Dam, a structure so trusted, so celebrated, that engineers at the time called it the Iron Dam, a name meant to reassure people it could never break. It broke, and when it did, it didn't just fail on its own. It set off a chain reaction that collapsed dozens of other dams downstream, one after another, in the dark, while the people meant to warn the villages below either couldn't get through or simply weren't asked to try. To understand how something like this happens, you have to go back to a country rebuilding itself from almost nothing, desperate to prove it could control the very rivers that had drowned its people for generations. You have to understand what it means to build a symbol first, and an engineering project second. And you have to understand what happens when the people closest to a growing crack in that symbol are told, gently but firmly, that raising concerns is not the same as being helpful. Because somebody did raise concerns, years before the water ever rose. An engineer looked at this dam, saw something wrong and said so, clearly in writing. And what happened to that warning, where it went, who read it, and why it didn't change anything, is arguably a more disturbing story than the flood itself. By the time the rain started falling in August of 1975, the dam wasn't just old, it was primed, and what followed over the next several hours wasn't really a natural disaster at all. It was a design flaw, a bureaucracy, and a silence, all finally colliding at once with a death toll that, to this day, the Chinese government has never fully confirmed. In the early years after 1949, China was a country trying to prove something to itself as much as to the world. Decades of war, famine, and flooding had left the population exhausted, and the rivers running through the heart of the country, the Huai River system among them, had a long, brutal history of breaking their banks and drowning entire regions. So the new government made a decision that felt, at the time, almost obvious. Tame the rivers, build dams, not just to generate power or store water, but to send a message that this country could finally control the forces that had controlled it for centuries. Banqiao Dam, built in the early 1950s in Henan Province, became one of the flagship projects of that effort. Soviet engineers, allied with China at the time, helped design it, bringing with them their own methods and their own assumptions about how much water a structure like this would ever realistically need to hold. It was massive for its time, a reservoir behind it, sluice gates built into its base to release water when levels got too high, and a reputation almost immediately as something unbreakable. People started calling it the Iron Dam, not because an engineer measured its strength and declared it so, because the government wanted people to believe it, and belief has a way of hardening into fact when nobody's allowed to question it out loud. But therefore, and this matters, when the Soviet Union and China's relationship soured a few years later, in the late 1950s, Soviet engineers and their oversight left the country, and with them went a layer of technical review that might have caught what came next. Chinese engineers were left to manage a design they'd inherited, not fully originated, under a government eager to show the world it didn't need Soviet help to finish what it started. And almost immediately cracks appeared. Not metaphorical ones, actual cracks in the concrete, visible not long after construction wrapped up. One engineer in particular, a man who had studied the dam structure closely, looked at those cracks and reached a conclusion that made almost everyone around him uncomfortable. He believed the dam's design was flawed at a fundamental level, that it simply didn't have enough capacity to safely release water during an extreme flood, that the sluice gates built into its base were inadequate for the kind of worst-case scenario the region was historically capable of producing. He put this in writing. He raised it through official channels, the way an engineer is supposed to. And here's where the story takes its first real turn toward tragedy, years before a single drop of the fatal rain would fall. His warning didn't get ignored because it was wrong. It got sidelined because of timing, and because of what raising it implied. This was a politically charged era in China, a period where questioning the success of state projects, especially high-profile ones built to symbolize national strength, could be read as questioning the state itself. Reinforcement work did happen. The dam was patched, strengthened in places, and additional sluice gates were eventually added to increase how much water it could release under pressure. On paper, that sounds like the system working exactly as it should. A flaw identified and a fix applied. But the reinforcement addressed the symptom, not the underlying assumption baked into the entire design, because the calculations behind how much water this dam and the dozens of smaller dams built alongside it in the same river system would ever need to handle in a true worst-case flood were never seriously revisited. The numbers used to size the sluice gates, the spillway capacity, the whole safety margin of the structure had been built around historical rainfall data that, as it turned out, dramatically underestimated what the region was actually capable of producing. It wasn't that nobody knew the dam had limits. It's that the people setting those limits didn't have the full picture, and the people who suspected the picture was incomplete had already learned the hard way what happens when you push too hard on an inconvenient question. By the mid-1970s, the dam had been standing for over 2 decades. It had weathered normal rainy seasons without incident. Officials pointed to that track record as proof the reinforcements had worked, proof the Iron Dam deserved its name. The engineer who had raised the original alarm was by this point largely on the margins of the conversation, his warning technically addressed, technically closed, filed away as a problem that had already been solved. It hadn't been solved. It had been patched just enough to survive an ordinary storm. And in August of 1975, an extraordinary one was coming. A storm so far outside anything the dam's designers had planned for that the entire concept of safety margin was about to become meaningless. The rain hadn't started yet, but every quiet compromise made over the previous 20 years had already decided in advance exactly how this story was going to end. To understand what happened next, picture a dam the way you'd picture a bathtub with the drain only half open. Water flows in through the faucet, that's the river, and the rain feeding it. Water flows out through the drain, that's the spillway and the sluice gates, the engineered openings built specifically to release water when the tub starts filling too fast. As long as water leaves at roughly the same rate it enters, the level stays manageable. But if the faucet suddenly opens far wider than the drain was ever designed to handle, the math stops being forgiving. It doesn't matter how strong the tub's walls are. Eventually, the water simply has nowhere else to go but over the top. That's the entire physics of what was about to happen at Banqiao, and it started with a storm that shouldn't have been geographically possible. In early August 1975, a typhoon named Nina made landfall on the Chinese coast, and instead of moving through and weakening the way storms typically do, it collided with a cold weather front and effectively got trapped, stalling directly over Hainan province for days. Meteorologists later described what followed as a rainfall event so extreme it broke virtually every historical record for the region. In some areas, close to a full year's worth of rain fell in about 24 hours. Not a strong storm, not even a record storm, an event so far beyond anything in the historical data used to design these dams that engineers decades earlier literally hadn't built for the possibility. Therefore, water surged into the Banqiao Reservoir at a rate the dam's designers had never planned for, and this is exactly where those decades-old compromises stopped being theoretical. The sluice gates, the ones added years earlier as a partial fix to the original engineer's warning, needed to be opened fully and immediately to release pressure. But several of them had been affected by silt buildup over the years, gates that hadn't been rigorously tested for a scenario this extreme, adding friction to a system that had almost no margin left to spare. Every hour of delay meant water rising higher behind a wall that was never designed to hold this much weight for this long. And it gets worse, because the people who needed to authorize emergency measures, opening every available gate, releasing water downstream before the situation became unsurvivable, weren't easy to reach. Communication lines in the region, telegraph and phone infrastructure, had been damaged by the storm itself. Reports on rapidly rising water levels were getting stuck somewhere between the dam site and the officials with the authority to act, delayed by a bureaucracy that, under normal conditions, moved through the proper channels methodically, carefully, exactly the way it was designed to. Except these weren't normal conditions. This was a situation counted in hours, sometimes less, and the system moving those decisions through the chain of command simply wasn't built for that kind of speed. So picture where this leaves things, hour by hour, through the night of August 7th, into the morning of August 8th. Water is rising behind the dam faster than any structure in the region was ever tested to handle. The gates that could relieve that pressure are only partially functional, and even fully open, there's real doubt whether they could have released water fast enough regardless. The people with the authority to order more drastic emergency action, potentially including deliberately breaching smaller dams upstream to save the larger, more critical ones downstream, are receiving fragmented, delayed information, trying to make decisions about a disaster unfolding faster than word of it can travel. And at the base of it all, quietly holding back an amount of water it was never engineered to contain. The dam that everyone had spent 2 decades calling unbreakable is running out of the one thing that actually mattered. In the very early hours of August 8, 1975, water finally rose past the top of the Banqiao Dam. This is a critical distinction, the kind engineers pay close attention to. A dam breaking from internal structural failure is one kind of disaster. A dam being overtopped, meaning water simply pours over the crest because there's more of it than the structure can hold back, is something else entirely, and in almost every case, something far more catastrophic. Once water starts flowing over the top of an earthen dam like this one, it begins eroding the structure from the outside, cutting into it, weakening it in places never designed to face direct water pressure. It's not a slow leak, it's a countdown, and sometime around 1 in the morning, the countdown ended. The dam gave way. Not gradually, explosively, in engineering terms, a catastrophic failure that released the entire reservoir behind it in a matter of hours rather than days. Survivors and later investigators described a wall of water estimated at roughly 6 meters high, moving downstream at speeds compared to a fast-moving vehicle on open road, tearing through a landscape of sleeping villages that had received no warning whatsoever. No sirens, no evacuation order, no time. For most people below the dam that night, the very first sign that anything was wrong was the sound itself, a roar building in the darkness seconds before the water arrived. And here's the part that turns a singular disaster into something almost incomprehensible in scale. Banqiao wasn't the only dam on this river system. It was one of dozens, part of a network of dams built across the same region during that same era of post-1949 river control. When Banqiao failed, the sudden massive surge of water didn't just flood the land below it, it slammed directly into the next dam downstream, one that was never designed to absorb a sudden release of this magnitude. That dam failed too, and its failure sent an even larger surge into the next one, and the next. A cascading, sequential collapse of dam after dam, each failure amplifying the flood behind it, racing across the province through the middle of the night while the people in its path were asleep, with no infrastructure in place to warn a single one of them in time. By the time the water finally spread out and lost its force, estimates suggest an area holding well over 10 million people had been affected in some way, homes destroyed, roads erased, entire agricultural regions turned into standing floodwater. Villages that had existed for generations were in the most literal sense wiped from the map in a single night. Survivors described clinging to rooftops, to floating debris, to trees, watching neighbors and family members disappear into water moving too fast and too dark to see anything clearly. And the disaster didn't end when the water receded. In the weeks that followed, with roads destroyed, communication infrastructure gone, and emergency response overwhelmed by a catastrophe of a scale nobody had planned for, disease spread rapidly through the affected population, clean water sources destroyed, sanitation systems gone, and huge numbers of people suddenly homeless in the middle of a Chinese summer with no shelter and dwindling food. Famine followed in the flood's aftermath almost as lethally as the water itself had, striking a population already stripped of everything it needed to recover. Estimates of the total death toll from the Banqiao disaster, counting both those killed directly by the flooding and those who died afterward from disease and starvation, range as high as 200,000 people. Some estimates run lower. The exact number has never been officially fully confirmed, and that uncertainty itself is not an accident. It's the next chapter of this story, because for over a decade after the water finally receded, most of the world had no idea any of this had happened at all. For more than 10 years, the Banqiao Dam disaster was, functionally, a secret. Not because it was small enough to hide easily, because a government that had spent 2 decades presenting large-scale infrastructure as proof of its own competence had very little incentive to broadcast a failure of this scale to the rest of the world. Information about the death toll, the cause, even the basic fact that a chain of dams had collapsed in a single night stayed almost entirely within China, tightly controlled for years. It wasn't until the late 1980s and early 1990s, as records slowly became available to outside researchers and engineers, that the international engineering community began to grasp the actual scope of what had happened in Henan province back in 1975, and by then it was already being quietly studied in dam safety circles as one of the most significant failures in the history of the field. And when engineers did finally get to examine what happened, the technical conclusion wasn't especially complicated. The dam's spillway capacity, the numbers that determined how much water it could safely release during an extreme flood, had been calculated using rainfall data that dramatically underestimated what the region was actually capable of producing. That's a real engineering failure, a legitimate design flaw, but it's not on its own a satisfying explanation for 200,000 deaths. Because design flaws get caught all the time. Somebody catches them, somebody raises a hand. Somebody did. Years before the flood, an engineer looked at this exact structure and warned, specifically, that its capacity to handle an extreme event was inadequate. And that warning didn't vanish, because it was technically wrong. It got absorbed into a system that treated confidence as more valuable than caution, in an era where questioning a state showcase project carried real personal risk. The reinforcements that followed his warning weren't nothing. They were real, they were engineered, they extended the dam's life by years. But they solved the version of the problem that was politically comfortable to solve, not the version that was actually true. That's the deeper failure sitting underneath the concrete one. Not a lack of expertise. China had and has extraordinarily capable engineers. Not a lack of warning. The warning existed, in writing, on record. What was missing was a system willing to let an uncomfortable truth travel upward without being softened at every level it passed through. Until what started as "this dam cannot survive a worst-case flood" arrived, years later, as "this dam has been reinforced and is safe." Two very different sentences. Only one of them was ever actually tested. In the decades since, Banqiao has quietly become one of the most studied failures in dam engineering anywhere in the world. Not because of a single design mistake, but because of what it proved about the gap between an engineer's honest assessment and an institution's need to declare a project finished, successful, and safe. Modern dam safety standards, particularly around spillway capacity and worst-case flood planning, were shaped in part by this event, even in countries where almost nobody has ever heard its name. The dam was rebuilt. It still stands today, holding back water in the same province, under the same sky that once produced a storm nobody thought was possible. Somewhere in an archive, filed years before the rain ever fell, is a piece of paper where someone got it right the first time.